Welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, well, the Australian election. Scott Morrison, or ScoMo as he's colloquially known, is staying on as Australia's Prime Minister for the next 4 years. Well, until someone ousts him, of course, which is something that's become a bit of a tradition. But to many, the election result was a bit of a surprise. So today on the Debunking Economics podcast, a bit of a therapy session for those who wanted Labour to win. Maybe it's good news they didn't, and maybe everybody should be happy with this result from both sides for different reasons. That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. Well, look, there were three big surprises over the weekend. First of all, the UK came last in the Eurovision Song Contest. But I guess we can look at that and, given the quality of Eurovision, it's actually perhaps the best accolade you can get. Secondly, over the weekend, Manchester City won the FA Cup final. We knew that was going to happen, but 6-0. That is quite a win, isn't it? But the biggest surprise, perhaps, was the Australian general election. It looks like voters returned Prime Minister Scott Morrison to power, a win for the Liberal National Coalition, even though the opinion polls... Well, actually, when I say a win, at this stage as we're recording this, it's not clear whether it's going to be an outright win or whether Scott Morrison's going to form a minority government. There's one seat in it. But the opinion polls have successively shown that it was going to be a Labour win. Now, Steve Keen, you have argued recently on this podcast that this is a good thing for Labour supporters because you think the Aussie economy is going to face such a downturn, you wouldn't want to be in government while that happens. And so all those people who are feeling disillusioned this morning because they'd wanted to see an overthrow of the coalition government, this might actually be the best outcome.
Yeah, I mean, when I first wrote that podcast, it was the blog that was related to on my Patreon page. It was partly tongue-in-cheek, but I thought about it and I thought, what has happened in the Australian electoral history since the Second World War is that virtually every time a Labor government has taken over, it's taken over during a credit boom, which has been given a huge stimulus to the economy, and then when it gets into office, the credit boom tanks, and that what just crashes the economy. So I'll give you, and then in saying this, by the way, I'm saying something that every mainstream economist listening will be laughing now, because according to them, credit plays no role in the economy. They're totally wrong. And I want to give an explanation. I'll explain why they're wrong after I've done some of the data and talking about this, what happened in the past year. But this is why I had my worries about the future for Australia. So if I look back at the Whitlam government, came to power in December 1972. And pretty much as soon as they came into power, something which was independent of them because it was a global phenomenon, was a huge increase in credit-based demand in the global economy, including Australia, and credit, which is defined by me as the change in debt, change in private debt, because what credit is money in your account that comes from a bank loan. The bank loan is the change in your outstanding debt. It aggregates to the national level. So we go back to when Whitlam was elected, which of course was the end of 1972, credit was running at 6% of GDP, and GDP itself was running at 4% per annum. So you can pretty much add the two and say there's about a 10% of GDP boost to demand in the economy. Credit went from 6% to 16%. So that's a huge increase. It then peaked in the middle of 1975 and fell by 76 to 10%. Kept on going and finally bottomed out at 6% again in 1978. Now, what actually drives the change in GDP is the change in the change in... What drives the change in GDP growth is change in credit, the second order of this thing. Taking a look at that, the change in credit, how fast credit was growing, changed from over 8% in 1974 to minus 4% in 1976, which was when Whitlam came, the end of 1975. That was when Whitlam crashed out of the economy. Now, that downturn was blamed on all sorts of stuff, bad management by the Labor government, the Kamlani loans, all sorts of stuff. But it was actually a global credit bubble that the Whitlam government had the misfortune of coming into power when the bubble began and being in office when the bubble burst. And that's when you got the bad, that we can't manage the economy argument.
Yeah.
Fast forward to the Keating government, and you find again on an even bigger scale the same story of a credit boom beginning when Labor was in power, and this particular credit boom began in the sort of mid-1984, At that stage, credit was 8% of GDP, went to 22%. It then plunged in the recession we had to do to -2%, which is the only time it's gone negative in the post-war period. Again, the same stage of the change of credit, that went from +8 to -10. When that happened, it looked like Keating stuffed up the economy. Yes, he played a role in that. I'm happily argue that with anybody, but some of the policies Keating put in place set up a credit bubble and then a bust afterwards. But the bust occurred on their watch. Bad managers hand over to Howard. The worst of the lot, of course, was poor Kevin Rudd. Now, I've been mentioning, I know there's too many numbers of people to take them, and I'm trying to give them a form of economic therapy, but the credit bubble that led under Howard began at 8% of GDP just after 2002. It peaked at 24% in 2008. It fell to 2%. That's an enormous plunge in demand. It happens on Rudd's watch. Now, Rudd, of course, did the stimulus package that softened the blow and stopped us going into negative credit that time round. But again, they got the blame, can't manage the economy, hand over to the Liberals. They've ridden another boom, which has taken credit from the bottom that was in Rudd's period of 2% of GDP up to 16%, which is a huge rise. It's then started to fall from that point. And as it comes down, it's bouncing around up and down at the moment. As it comes down, the economy will have less demand, in it, particularly the housing bubble bursts. The economy will go into a funk. That will happen regardless of who is Prime Minister.
So and whatever their policies, yeah.
Yeah, and it's going to happen on Morrison's watch. So this is one time, rather than saying Labor's to blame, but this time it's going to be Liberals to blame.
And they are
very hard to... Yeah,
they are so far from being aware of that, aren't they? Because if you look at the Liberal manifesto, for example, they do talk about debt, but obviously it's all about government debt.
Yeah.
Even there's a huge amount of hypocrisy. And I know this isn't the point you're trying to make, but it's just an interesting side point because they do say we're paying down Labour's debt, but in fact, when they took office, the government debt was 165 billion. Now it's 341 billion or more. That was July last year. So they've actually doubled government debt in their office. But even so, it's. They haven't got. This is just not on the horizon. The idea of private debt, not just in Australia but around the world. So that's politics. You missed the key point.
Yeah, and by missing the key point, in other words, they're walking into a credit crunch because credit plays no role in their thinking. So when the credit crunch hits, they'll be in charge, and it's then what do they do to try to cope with the downturn? Now, and if they stumble, which they will, then it'll be the Liberals who wear the opprobrium for it, and then you won't have the narrative, you can't trust Labor with the economy, but I'd say we can't trust the Liberals with the economy either. So it's giving the chance to the narrative for once, not to be the Labor Party's in power when the economy tanks. It's the party that's in power when credit tanks is the one that gets the blame. This time, it'll be Liberals, not Labor. So it's small solace, I know, for many, many people, because so many people are thinking about ending the discriminatory policies and refugee stuff. Not that Labor's much better on that front, frankly.
No.
Protecting the ABC. They're sick of Morrison, the whole Liberal Party politics, the coal, the environment stuff, etc., etc. Yes, that's all something that we're going to see lots of negatives about, but we'll have to cope with those.
Yeah.
But
just on that, I think Yanis Varoufakis's reaction to it, my daughter's reaction, he said, to the news of the Australian election: goodbye ABC, goodbye Great Barrier Reef, goodbye public services, goodbye renewable energy, goodbye public health, goodbye public education, and goodbye stunning river systems. Actually, I think he's probably kidding himself or his daughter as if they think that the Labor Party would have delivered all of those things. I suspect not.
Yeah, they would have delivered some things, but nothing near enough. And yes, there's going to be, the ABC, I think they're going to try to privatise the ABC. They're certainly going to try to get even with the ABC, because they'll always blame the ABC for any of the negative coverage they got. So yes, all that stuff is going to happen. But they are going to walk into an economic storm which could start in the next 6 months to a year. And when that does happen, all their ideas about returning the government to surplus, presiding over good unemployment levels, falling unemployment, that will all go out the window, and they'll be in panic. And in that panic, they may well do the right thing for the wrong reasons. This is what happened with the Bush administration, which, of course, copped the beginning of the financial crisis. It began in 2007, late August 2007 was the beginning of the downturn. By middle of 2008, it was clearly a disaster. That's when you had the Treasury Secretary at the time coming out and saying, if we don't get $700 billion, may God have mercy on our souls, because we'll preside over the collapse of capitalism. They went into panic mode. They threw a massive amount of money at the economy, handed over to Obama, who continued their same throwing money at Wall Street rather than Main Street. But it revived the economy enough to avoid going totally down. And I think the Liberals will be forced into the same thing. Now, what that means is they're going to go massively into deficit when they're selling themselves to the government that can run a surplus. Running a surplus is stupid. I'm going to talk about that shortly. But they'll be forced to run a deficit. How is the Murdoch press going to handle defending the Liberals when they're running a deficit? If it was Labor running a deficit, attack mode. If it's Liberals running a deficit, what the hell can they say? So there's ways in which this is a better period to see the Liberals fumble with the credit crisis than having it land in Labor's lap once again.
Well, the Liberal Party has said on housing affordability that, Labor's answer on housing affordability, because that's what, houses are going to become more affordable because they're losing value so much.
They're falling. It's a great way to get first-time buyers. Prices are falling. Wonderful.
But the Liberal Party, basically, the coalition has said they're going to help more Australians become homeowners. They're going to support more investment in the housing market to provide more affordable options for renters, but will not undermine the value of Australian homes or investment properties. I'm not quite sure how they're going to perform that magic trick, but it's too late because they already have, or it's already happening.
Yeah, and this is what's worked in the past, and it worked for Rudd as well, was to drag first-time buyers into the market by giving them a large amount of money, which they then took to the banks and made it 10 times as much money by leverage borrowing, and then bid up the price of the houses by pretty much all of that 10 times the grant they got, and bang, we had a housing boom. But that was only possible when we had a lower level of housing debt than we have right now. At the moment, Australia is carrying a housing debt level of about 120% of GDP. Now, that is the highest on the planet outside Switzerland. And two things about Switzerland. First of all, it's running a huge balance of trade surplus, and that can make up for if that can help you carry a higher level of household debt, and that's what I think is happening there. Plus, also a lot of that money, a lot of the recording for Switzerland is the old Swiss gnomes bank accounts stuff, which is actually transacted from the rest of the world for the Swiss banking system. We don't have that. The only comparable country to us is Ireland. Because Ireland had a private debt level of about 118% for the household sector, and they run a trade deficit as well. They've now plunged right down to 50%, and that's that caused a huge collapse in the Irish economy back in the 2008-2012 period. Now, so we are carrying a global record in that sense of a level of household debt. We're not going to. I can't see even the most generous so-called handouts to first-home buyers dragging them back to the market again. This probably isn't going to work, and therefore the stimulus won't work to recover the house price direction. And the double whammy for the economy when there's falling house prices is people reducing the level of debt. They're not increasing it. They're writing off. They're going bankrupt, some of them, because they don't have the income anymore. The credit demand's fallen, so they've lost their job. They're paying down their debt. By paying down their debt, you reduce the amount of money in the economy. There's less turnover that way. That's what causes a plunge. And the house price plunge precedes the economic plunge. When that economic plunge comes along, the Liberals are going to be in panic. And that, to me, is a better way of saying it's not Labor versus Liberal. It's not understanding credit, not understanding the economy, and then trying to do the wrong thing of running a government surplus, which Bowen was bragging about. We'll get back to surplus faster than the Liberals.
Now, before they do
all
that,
these things were wrong-headed.
Before they do that, before they start pumping money into the economy in blind panic, which you're saying, is actually going to be a good thing for all the wrong reasons. They are obviously going to say, well, we need to pump more money by giving people more money, so we're going to cut tax, which is actually something both parties have said. They both basically said tax cuts for the middle class. They might have different ideas of what the middle class is, but paying less seems to be the common promise to the voter in this election. I guess they would argue, well, yeah, if you've got more money in your pocket, then you can pay down that debt and you can keep the economy, growing.
Yeah, but I mean, I think in many ways, in terms of their understanding of how the economy functions and talking about the government running a surplus, it was basically Tweedledum versus Tweedledee on that front.
For sure.
Neither of them understand what's happening. So I'd rather have the Liberals in a panic than Labor in a panic when it happens.
Yeah.
And then when that does occur, people can say, well, they're both promising to do the same thing. They're both saying, let's get the government back to surplus, and it'll make the economy stable and safe. And in fact, it's in the context of a collapse in the private spending, debt-financed private spending, that plunges. What will happen is the economy goes down and government spending will go up. They'll go from running a deficit to a surplus if they attempt to get there, to an unintended deficit. And people hopefully will start saying, well, maybe the formula they had of running a surplus for the government is a good idea, doesn't make much sense. And that's all Australians need to learn, because it doesn't make any sense. This is getting into the, and I'm throwing too many numbers at what I'm calling a therapy session here for the morning progressives, but the basic logic is if you save money, somebody else just saves. Let's say there's $1,000 in circulation that turns over once a year, and I've got 500 of it, and you've got 500 of it. We're a two-person economy. I'm spending 500 on you, you're spending 500 on me. Total amount is 1,000. Your 500 I'm spending on you and 500 you're spending on me. If I decide to spend 100 less on you, and there's this 1,000 in circulation, I'm going to accumulate $100 that year. My account's going to go from 500 to 600. Yours is going to go from 500 to 400. My saving causes your dissaving. So what actually happens when you try to save money like that is the actual turnover of money slows down and the economy goes down.
Yeah.
And if you want to save money, you see the aggregate savings is zero. And this is a little accounting thing people in mainstream economics don't have their heads around, and most of the public doesn't either. If you save, if there's a fixed amount of money in the economy and you decide to save to accumulate more of it, the rest of the economy has to accumulate precisely negative what you accumulate. And then therefore that doesn't work. The only way you can actually have a growing economy in this sense, and it's okay, I'm leaving out the ecological stuff for the moment, which is one of my main interests, but if we're going to, a numerically growing economy over time, you have to be creating new money by somebody who can afford to go into debt. Now, can we afford to go into debt, the public?
No, but the government,
from the banks.
But the government can.
The government can, because when the government's creating its own money by having a national currency. We all have the joke recently about the $50 note having a misprint on it. I think their responsibility is spelled irresponsibly as a mistake in the spelling. Nonetheless, the government produced 46 million of those, and the government's got the right to produce those 46 million because it owns the bank, it owns the mint. So it doesn't have any possibility of running out of money because it creates the stuff. Now, if we try to create the money ourselves, we end up in jail for counterfeiting. So we don't have the capacity the state has to create money. And therefore, what the government debt tends to be is a record of how much money it's created in the past. So the government, so long as you're running a trade surplus or a balanced budget in trade, which is, I differ from modern monetary theory in this argument, but as long as you've got a trade surplus, you can continue doing it indefinitely. Running a trade deficit, you have a limitation, and I think Australia faces that limitation. Too much government spending could actually cause a trade increase in the trade deficit, and that would cause a plunge in the currency and a crisis that way. The country like Japan, it put debt crisis back in 1990, 30 years later, has had a huge low rise in government debt. Its government debt has gone from 40% of GDP to 250%, enormous increase in government debt levels. Yep. No problem because it's running a trade surplus. Australia...
Still got a GDP around zero, though, and possibly about to go into negative with figures.
GDP growth. But
yeah.
But it is wrong-headed to say the government should run a surplus, because the government runs a surplus. The non-government, which is the rest of the world related to the government, runs a deficit for precisely as much. So and the thing is, can you afford to run a deficit? Australia, if you run private sector run a deficit, you've got to borrow money from the banks. Can you afford to get more indebted to the banks? Or you run a deficit internationally. Can we afford that? No. So the government should be running a deficit to provide a matching surplus in private sector accounts.
Now, how that deficit is created, though, I mean, there's two ways. On the one is that the government just issues the money and then gets that into circulation somehow, and the other way surely is through tax cuts. So if we look at what's been done in the United States, for example. I mean, the government has run heavily into debt and is having to issue bonds at unprecedented levels to try and cover these tax cuts that Donald Trump has introduced. Now, sure, most of those tax cuts have been felt by the rich, but if he'd been a little bit more measured in his approach and managed to make sure those cuts were cutting across all sectors, isn't that way of buoying things along? And
it is. There will be a stimulus to the economy. I don't think it's going to be big enough in the Australian case to right over.
No, because they're going to try and balance the budget at the same time. So they're going to cut public services as well.
Cutting services, all that sort of stuff. So it will be a mess when they're going into it. But if they're hit by a recession they're not expecting, they're not ready for, they'll be in panic. The Murdoch press will be paralysed about how they criticise the government that they supported into office when the government's doing what they said the opposition would do if they got in power. They'll be in a funk. We can sit back and watch the fun, but the Morrison government being in panic and the Murdoch press not knowing what the hell to say. And now that is better than being in the other situation where the crash occurs on Labor's watch. Labor gets by the media. It looks like the story is consistent. Can't trust the Labor Party. Bang, we have a reactionary form of the Liberal Party we have at the moment. And I think, thank God, we've got rid of Tony Abbott. It's one positive for the body politic that particular cancer has been kicked into, go surfing, Tony. You're not going to be in Parliament anymore. That is a positive. But if we had the same thing as last time, I'll go back to my favourite. Keating won. Houston lost the unlosable election, and Keating went on for an extra few years. Then we got John Howard. Now, I know John Houston. I've met him a couple of times. He's a decent being. He had a more clear-headed idea of the conventional economic policies than Howard had. There's no way that man would have done the children overboard nonsense. He was never have done the racist stuff that ended up happening to migrants. We got all that through John Howard. If Keating had lost that election and Houston had taken over, the economy would have... He actually was in a recovery phase then, so Houston would have got a few years. We wouldn't have had the whole tragedy of the let's call it racist, simple way to summarise it, racist immigration policy and pandering to the redneck stuff. If the Tampa had occurred on John Hughes' watch, we would have taken the people on board as refugees. We wouldn't have done the travesty that happened with the Tampa election. Keating winning that election was relatively, for the Labor movement in general, for the Australian population in general, it was a disaster because we got John Howard instead. So this time round, I'd rather put up with Morrison. Thank God it's not Abbott we're losing to. You get Morrison. It happens on Morrison watch. Then this fact that the economic downturn occurs on the Liberal Party watch hopefully begins to wipe out that narrative that Labor crashes the economy. But it's global factors and credit that crashes the economy.
Yeah.
Let's happen on Liberals' watch rather than Labor.
So Labor is, if you look through, maybe it'll change the Labor Party as well. Maybe Labor will come back with a more progressive approach because it's hardly, but if you look at progressive governments around the world, some people might say it's extreme to compare to the Labor Party in the UK where they're trying to renationalise a great deal of things, where they are trying to reintroduce free education for all, to get rid of student debt and all that sort of good stuff. There's nowhere in the world right now you could push that sort of agenda in Australia because it's too far right. The person in the street would probably reel at the expense of all of that without understanding that governments can create money. So maybe if things go badly wrong, if progressives are looking for something to take out of all of this, maybe they'll get a more progressive government at the end of it than they would this time around because they were trying to move to the centre ground. You look at what was, some of the arguments that were being held. It was pretty small stuff, wasn't it? There's the argument that one of the reasons they lost the election is because of this whole thing about franking credits. The rebate that you pay to shareholders. So for people who don't understand that, a company makes a profit. It pays tax on that profit, then it pays dividends. And the argument is because the money's already been taxed as a profit, shareholders shouldn't have to pay it. So they get a credit for their income tax that they would have paid on that dividend, which is sort of piffling stuff, really. And it really only applies to high income earners because your income tax has got to be higher than company tax for it to be worthwhile. But that has been, strangely, under Australian politics. I think anywhere else in the world would think, well, that's small stuff. It only applies to a small number of people. It's probably not a great deal of money, but it's been a lot of focus in this election, rather than the big picture stuff. Australian politics just seems to deal with these micro issues which get blown out of all proportion by the right-wing media.
And it was because we had such a long period of growth without the technical recession. We went for one negative quarter during the global financial crisis, but only one, so no technical recession was recorded. And therefore you had this long period where even the progressive voters in the country haven't had to learn about what it's like to go through an economic crisis. And if you look at what happened with the UK, what happened in modern monetary theory discussions in American politics right now, I'm sure a major reason why that is prominent is because of the crisis in 2008. And that traumatized people and made them think, well, what we thought worked didn't really work. Now, if you have a modern monetary theory discussion in Australia, you don't even get to first base with the media and with most of the public. Whereas in America, because of AOC, because of Bernie Sanders, because of Stephanie Kelton and the whole modern monetary theory group, this is a front-page discussions of the New York Times. It's sending up its motions in Congress. There's nowhere near that level of maturity in Australian debate, as you're saying. And part of the reason for the lack of maturity is we haven't experienced the bad times.
Yeah.
The delay. But each time we delay it, the level of private debt has risen. If I go back, I'm going to take you through some numbers again. But if you go back to when the Whitlam government lost power, then at that stage, the level of private debt was, and I'm looking at my numbers here, was 20% of GDP. You go up to when Keating lost, it was 115% of GDP. You go up to when Rudd lost, it was 190% of GDP. You go up to the peak now, it's 205% of GDP. Each time we've delayed it, we've accumulated a high level of private debt, which means we're falling from a higher cliff. In America's case, compare America. America peaked in the global financial crisis at 170%, is now at 150. So we're sitting 50 or 60% of GDP above their level of debt. It's a higher cliff we're jumping from. And it's about time, unfortunately, we jump off that cliff and let what it feels like to be fall down from it. Then look at it and say, should we have got into that in the first place? How did we get here? You then look at, well, maybe the government trying to run surpluses actually helped trigger this. And you then can get a change of narrative as has occurred in America and obviously say also happened in the UK. But the Australian debate remains so immature, and if it had another crash on the watch of a Labor government, that immaturity would have been maintained.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, how money has shifted in Australia from what would normally be a government expense to a private expense. So you just need to look at, how many people send their kids to schools, which are private schools in Australia. 35% of all school kids in Australia go to private schools. It's up from 23% in 1970. In the UK right now, it's 7%. In Australia, it's 35%. So you get all those school fees which people are paying, which is actually a government expense. And having said that, the crazy thing is, of course, the government then goes and pays for them as well. So the independent schools in Australia are getting $9,000 per student, whereas government schools are only getting $13,000. So he's still, whereas in this country, in the UK, the government gives nothing to independent schools. If you want to send your kid to an independent school, pay for it yourself. None of it's coming from the taxpayer. So and there's this user pays type mentality as well, which exists in Australia. So it's quite a fundamental capitalist nation which hasn't embraced sort of I think it used to, didn't it? This idea of a mixed economy, which we seem to have lost. We lost in the 80s. And Australia seems to have embraced it more than most. So actually trying to get a progressive government in Australia is a big ask because the nation's psyche has moved so far from that way of thinking.
What's actually helped us with developing that psyche is as the physical economy's been downgraded, there's no more car manufacturing in Australia.
Yeah.
And the car manufacturers who worked there were all, 100% foreign-owned subsidiaries of General Motors and Ford and Mitsubishi and everybody else. At least there were the manufacturing jobs and skills were there. They're completely gone. We've papered it over by what the macro business website calls houses and holes. We've dug holes in the ground and sold our resources off. We haven't done any processing domestically. We put that into more expensive houses. We haven't built the infrastructure and the physical economy. So when a downturn comes, we can no longer rely upon credit or house prices to rescue us. And we're going to see how much damage we've done. And then in that aftermath, we start to learn the lessons that in that sense the UK and the USA have already learned.
So why did he win? You know, we've got a man now in Australia who's prime minister. As you say, it's a better choice than his predecessor, or not his predecessor actually. So it's the predecessor of the predecessor. Predecessor of the predecessor who lost out on Saturday night. But we still have a man. I mean, maybe people needed stability. Maybe that's the pure argument that they thought, well, let's try and have a prime minister for more than a year. You know, it's better than the devil you know than be than somebody perhaps you don't know. But we've still got a man who says remarkably stupid things, like calling his wife his love machine.
Oh, you're kidding! I didn't know that one.
He brought his, bringing a lump of coal into Parliament to show how little he cares about climate change. And then there was, when he was joking about standing underwater in Nauru. I mean, he's not one of the world's great diplomats, is he? And yet he got in. Why did it happen, do you think?
Again, I think because there wasn't enough passion on the other side. I saw a couple of arguments about this, and some of the reports after the event saying, why did this happen? And partly said there was a real passion about Hawke and Keating with the Accord, which I was part of, by the way, and there was also passion about Whitlam, obviously. There's no passion about Shorten. It was just kind of, let's replace incompetence with competence. That was about the message. And then, as you said, things like the franking credits.
It's nonsense.
That was enough to say, well, I don't want to risk that particular one. It was, in that sense, it was a pocket election. When people might be election about climate change, etc., it was, thank God, in Tony Abbott's own electorate, but it wasn't across the entire country. And there's been a degree of alienation, which we see in Queensland, between people who want to protect the environment and people who want to have jobs. Now, for a while, we can believe that those two are alternatives. At some point, we're going to realise otherwise. But there's no way that argument was won people in Queensland. And unless you win it at the national level, you're not going to win it at all. And so, but I think the hip pocket nerve, the fact there was no particular passion to change over, and Morrison, was, at least in terms of, I mean, the guy does have some skill at marketing. He did, of course, create the "Where the Bloody Hell Are You" campaign. I rest my case, but not as incompetent as Tony is. He didn't knight Prince Philip.
No.
That's one positive for Morrison.
No, that's because he'd already been knighted, perhaps. But no, I don't think he's quite the royal, is he, that Tony Abbott was. Yeah. But look, what about generally we are, around the world, though, we are shifting to the right. I mean, we've got Trump. The UK could well end up with Boris, although, Theresa May is, with a hostile environment policy and austerity was enough for many. You look at countries like Hungary, for example, which has shifted so far to the right. In Hungary now, they're so against foreigners that you don't pay tax if you have 4 children. They want to grow the local population. They so hate foreigners that they will give you complete tax exemption if you become a baby factory. And, we're going to see right-wing parties sweeping, well, in Hungary, 70% of the vote in the European elections this week is expected to go to far-right parties. In Austria, we've got the Freedom Party that's expected to get 26% of the vote. In the UK, the Brexit Party is going to get 30%. There's this real tide towards nationalism, and Australia just seems to be caught up in that. Maybe we should, not look at it at the local level and just say this is part of the world picture. Not sure why that's happening, apart from income disparity is clearly part of it, and that means we hate foreigners. And Australia perhaps is just part of that tide.
Well, partly I actually take it back to the whole embrace of neoliberalism by the left, and in this case, Keating and Hawke played a major role in this, because the basic argument is, particularly after the Whitlam government experience, was we need to be better economic managers. What does that mean? We read the economic textbooks and do what the economic textbooks tell us to do. And then we do the social stuff as well. So we have a booming economy courtesy of following sound economic advice, or we do progressive social policies. That sound economic advice is why I wrote Debunking Economics. It's nonsense. It's bad ideas about an economy. But the economic theory itself is wrong. What then happens is when you do that sort of stuff in an advanced industrialised economy,
it ends up destroying your industrial sector. The workers lose their jobs. They then look at the so-called left and see them as being people who don't care about their jobs and have actually, wiped out their employment, leaving them going from being, skilled industrial workers to working at henny penny if they're lucky, or being on welfare, not caring about the fact that their factories are now run down and so on, and doing all this vastly left stuff. And what happened was he ended up undermining not just the economic side of the left, which always used to be supporting the working class. It also undermined the socially progressive policies put forward. And they have the working class, the middle, the lower class is the farmers, the actually working with their hands. To some extent, like saying you're a bunch of socialists who don't care about our livelihoods. We're going to vote with the Conservatives. So to some extent, I want to see the neoliberal agenda de-legitimised, and Australia has kept it alive for longer. And in that sense, the Labor Party's program is a classic neoliberal policy. And if it had occurred on their watch again, it would have discredited giving a control on the economy. For liberals, it's rather harder.
So we've got a really bad line all of a sudden, so we'll probably leave it there. I guess the upshot for everybody is, if you are feeling a little bit disillusioned about the turn of events in Australia, bear with it for 4 years, because it's going to be a rocky 4 years, whoever was in power, and maybe this will become a turning point, and maybe the Labor Party will feel renewed and invigorated. And perhaps we'll have a clearer understanding, actually, and less of a neoclassic approach to their attitude towards economics, and be a true progressive party at the end of this. Perhaps with a bit of passion thrown in as well. That would be nice.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary, man.
All right. See you soon.
Okay.
And that is it for this time on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. We are back next time talking about the sharing economy and how that is changing our lives. Tune in for that one. Thanks for listening this time. We'll see you again soon.